I was saying, so last year, Middle East Studies, Syrian conflict was a theme of a lecture series, and we had a series of events in the program, and the Dean's Forum as well had events, including one which included the former US ambassador to Syria and the SAIS alum, Robert Ford. This year, actually, Middle East Studies intended our themes to be art, pop culture, and media. We think it's very important and very profound what's happening to the young Arab generations. There's a shift there. It's very dynamic, but the interest was actually quite lacking. We were a bit disappointed in that, partly because it's far away from the themes that are important to Washington, that, all the political discourse that you have, and not a lot of attention is paid to culture and art. So that's why I was particularly delighted when the Big Picture Forum, housed in the Foreign Policy Institute, invited Middle East Studies to join in this event today that ties Syria with art, and its culture. The heart of the event is the documentary work of musician and photographer Jason Hammacher, who's on the stage. You will find his work all around you in this room, and on the floor outside you will find his work, his pictures of Syria and mostly Aleppo in the years before the war. To this testimony, to his visual testimony, we add today a conversation about the lives, memories, and personal narratives and histories of people who share a connection to Aleppo. But before I introduce the three panelists, I will say a few words about Aleppo at the turn of the century from the point of view of an outsider. I only went to Aleppo twice when I lived in Damascus. It was both weekend trips to do the touristy stuff. That itself was an adventure because there were no tourists in Aleppo back then. Really, you find over 3 days, you will find 2, 3 foreigners, and that was about the end of it. Even the Gulfies, there was quite a lot of Gulfies in the summer in Damascus who were just going there, but they would never make it to Aleppo. It was just really empty, and it was a pity because there's a lot there. There's a lot of history. It has been continuously inhabited for 13,000 years, and you can witness that. You can see the traces of that history, and obviously in the pictures you see that. Going back 3 millennia, there's a promontory on which stands the citadel, the famous citadel of Aleppo, probably the landmark of the country. Next to it, not far, you have, from the 11th century, you have the great mosque, Halab al-Kabir, and not far from it, the interminable city souk. It's like Souk al-Medina, which is kilometers and kilometers of dark, cool, covered souk, and galleries that were built in the 14th century. But the most striking to me actually was not in Aleppo, but outside, just right outside of Aleppo. It's the church of St. Simeon, some 30 kilometers in the northwest of the city. It's magnificent ruins of Roman architecture from the 5th century, standing in the middle of nowhere with no human in sight, and from where you could be all by yourself just watching an occur sunset. Now, beyond the sunset, what was also striking about St. Simeon at the time was the complete lack of development. There was no guard, no fence, no guide, not even a bus to get there. You really had to find your way to St. Simeon. The citadel downtown, in the middle of town, had a gate, but there was hardly any sign of renovation or protection that you would find usually in such places. The mosque was full of local worshippers, but there were no visitors. The souk was a real market. It was not a tourist trap that you can find in places like Marrakesh. Essentially, a souk was a market for the people who lived there. You could buy the cheap stuff from China that make the daily modern life that we all share. And soap, tons of soap, like greenish cubic soap. Aleppine are very clean people. But striking between the souk and the mosque were also the mesh of electrical wires, as thin as extension cord that you could see chaotically from bringing powers to the apartments from the poles. I don't know if they were paying for this or just stealing it, but that was a sign of something going on. We could find one hotel to stay in at the time. It was Hotel Le Baron, which allegedly was patronized by T. Lawrence and Agatha Christie. It had not been renovated since Colonel Lawrence visited it, at least that's the way it seemed to me. But it was very easy to find a room just at the last minute. You just showed up, and they would just open a room for you. To dine out, there was not a lot as well. You had to go to your Armenian quarter to find an outdoor place to have dinner. Now, the reason I tell you all of this, if I want to sum up all of what I described, is with one word, it's neglect. Beyond the old ruins, etc., there was complete neglect. It was neglect of culture, neglect of infrastructure, and really economic neglect. That was this kind of stunted development was typical of Syria during the late Hafez year, at the turn of the century. But it was much worse in Aleppo than it was Damascus. There was something going on in Damascus. There was a bit of activity, but Aleppo was being really just abandoned by the regime. And the reason why we have, here I'm just speculating, might have been the fact that Aleppo had risen or had participated in the troubles in the early 80s against the regime. There was some protest there, there was some turbulence. And this is the period, of course, when you may know that the city of Hama was very heavily bombarded and there was a massacre. And Aleppo was part of that. And it seems that Hafez just, besides punishing Hamas so brutally, just turned its back on the north of the country and completely disinvested himself from that region. Now, Assad died in 2000, his son came in power, Hafez died, his son came in power, and things changed a bit. His clique, the clique of cronies around the new leader, tried to bring some industry to Aleppo, and some factories were opened and new quarters were built. A Sheraton hotel opened there in 2007, not far from the citadel. But that new attitude towards Aleppo turned to fury after the Arab Spring, as you know. In 2016, the city was besieged. It was heavily bombed in the last month for several months during that year, and it fell around December at the end of the year, and a lot of the population was actually cleansed from the center of the town. And also a lot of the historical marvels that I've been describing you have been, if not destroyed, at least kind of heavily damaged by those bombings. Now, you hear the same story from insiders, there's two for now, but there's going to be a third one who's just arriving from Chicago. Wonderful speakers that Shamila has assembled here. On my far right, you have Jason Hammacher, the author of those pictures. He's the founder and director of Lost Origin Productions and the Lost Origin Gallery in Mount Pleasant in Washington. And he took those pictures between 2005 and 2010. Next to him is Farah Hassan. She's a Syrian-American writer, filmmaker, and soon-to-be attorney. Her family is from Aleppo, and she's the associate producer of the documentary Syria, Between Iraq and a Hard Place. Here will be Lina Sergi Hattar, a Syrian-American architect and a writer from Aleppo. And she also she's the founder and CEO of the Karam Foundation, which is a charity that takes care that helps the Syrian refugees. And she's a very good friend of Michel Ajami, who's also a friend of mine. That's my connection to her. But now I give the floor to Shamila Chaudhary, our host and the moderator for this event. Shamila leads the big picture, the forum, and that is also tonight, and she'll be the moderator for the rest of the evening. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to switch and let you sit next to our guests.
Sorry.
Good to see you. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi.
You were flying out of Chicago Airport,
Yes.
right? So you're guaranteed to be late if you're flying in or out of Chicago.
Yes.
So welcome. Thank you for joining us, everyone, for something that is very special and unique to SAIS, where we have a combination of conversation, music, as well as visual arts. It's a new interdisciplinary approach we're trying to take here, which I have learned requires a lot of effort on the part of many different offices. And so everything that you see here today is the product of collaboration between the Dean's Office, Middle East Studies, the Foreign Policy Institute, the Facilities and Operations team and the AV team, and also an organization known as One Journey, who's kind of sponsoring a festival for celebrating the talents of refugees. And Wendy Chan is a SAIS alum who is leading the helm. And so I just want to thank everyone's support for today's event. And if you're interested in the festival, it'll be June 2nd, and SAIS will be playing a role there as well. All of this to say that there are a lot of stakeholders in these issues, not just kind of the government or policymakers that we often talk about at SAIS and all of the events that we host on security issues and negotiations. There are a lot of different perspectives that don't get highlighted, but our students, when they leave, will need to know what these different stakeholders and communities feel and believe and see in order to make good, concrete policy. So that's really the vision for this and every other event that we've done. I mean, I just like to restate that because often people will say, well, why are you having a photography exhibit at SAIS? And that's why we're having it. I also wanted to do this panel because these three people are all connected to Aleppo. And when I think of Aleppo, I think of a place that sounds familiar to me because I've seen it on the news, I've seen visuals of the place. I feel like I know the place, but I don't really know the place. I don't have a genuine understanding of it. And I suspect that that is the case with a lot of other Americans or members of the international community. And so the true kind of purpose of this panel is to show you those personal connections, which involve kind of professional work and affiliations. And it's, as Camille said, it's built around the work that Jason did during his time in Syria. And he has a really interesting story of how he came to do this work. And so I'd like to start with Jason, who is an entrepreneur. He's a punk rock musician.
Sorry.
He's a photographer. He's a man of many talents. There's probably some other things in there that I don't know about. But tell us how you got to Aleppo. What brought you there?
So primarily, I play drums in hardcore punk rock bands from this city. And 13 years ago, it was 2005, I had a band break up, and in a rage, I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. And so the idea was, we broke up the night before a tour, so I had 2 weeks off, and I never have time off. So I went to a friend's house for dinner, and the concept was, I'm at home, I need to do something creative, but something that also reflects all of my other interests, well, some of my other interests. And so to do something that's more Kennedy Center and less 930 Club is kind of the way that I describe it. And so the idea was, let's come up with, is that confusing? So for example, my bands played in underground clubs and places all over the planet. Like, we played hardcore punk. And so my idea was, how can I combine my interest of history, my enthusiasm towards ancient cultures, with what I do musically? And the only thing that me and my friends could come up with was, let's do an orchestra. Let's get a symphony of hardcore punk rock musicians, meaning a 40-member symphony, but have restricted to only rock instrumentation. So instead of writing songs Beatles style, we'd write it like Schubert style or whatever, like these big sweeping symphonic movements. And so I was driving through Rock Creek Park, and my friend called me and said, hey, I found these amazing chants from Serbia that I think you're gonna love. And I totally misunderstood him. And I was like, dude, I never got to go to Syria. I would love to hear them. And he was like, no, I said Serbia. He's like, dude, I was so close to the border and I could never get there. He's like, no. And then I drove through the tunnel by the zoo and my phone cut off, and it sparked the memory of this book where this guy allegedly found like the ancient Christian music in the deserts of Syria. He's like, that is what we've got to rock out to, man. Like, we go find this ancient stuff. And so I come to the other side of the tunnel. This is honestly how this happened. I came to the other side of the tunnel, and I called him back, and I was like, dude, remember the book where the guy finds this ancient chanting in the deserts of Syria? He's like, I said Serbia. And I was like, dude, forget Serbia. He's like, no, this stuff sounds incredible. I was like, fine. You research Serbia. I'm going to go try to research Syria and figure out how to get a hold of this stuff. And for the sake of time, because the story's really long, I ended up being on the phone with the Archbishop of the Syrian Orthodox Church of the United States, asking permission to do my rock orchestra with his like ancient sacred holy music. And his response was, this is very interesting. He was like, well, I don't have the music you're looking for, but I've got something similar. I was like, well, how do I get what I'm looking for? It's like, I don't have anything to give you. I was like, I will pay whatever it costs to get a CD from the Mesopotamia, wherever it is, whether it's in modern Turkey or Syria, wherever, to my house in DC. He's like, no, we just don't have a recording of it. And I was like, you mean we with a capital W? I was like, it's one of the oldest chants on the planet, and you don't have a recording of it? He was like, unfortunately, no, we don't. I was like, do you want me to make one for you? And he was like, what do you mean? I was like, I will go to Syria and make a recording of this if you don't have one. And then that's when the whole symphony got abandoned. I basically volunteered with the Orthodox Church and went many times over 2005 to 10 to go record these ancient religious traditions. And once I kind of started getting into all of it, the nuance of this is the oldest, no, this is the oldest. Like everyone's the oldest, right? Like everything, like Aleppo's the oldest, but if you talk to someone from Damascus, like Damascus is the oldest. Or Jericho is also, like everyone kind of vies for this, like antiquity labels. And so what ended up happening was over the years, I was just a rock guy that was a photographer, so I started taking pictures, started doing these recordings, and then just kind of kept elevating over the years. And then it ended, my time in Syria ended with the breakout of the war, and I didn't get to finish a lot of things that I was working on. In summary, I was trying to go record a record. That's what took me to Aleppo.
And your host was the church.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your hosts, and because you're very well traveled, but you had never been to Syria before, and so obviously you did depend on them a little bit, and
a lot.
Yeah.
So I was not. I've been to many places on the planet, but I'd never been to Syria. I'd been to, a lot of the Near East, and my host was the Syrian Orthodox Church, and the person I lived with was the Archbishop of Aleppo, and his nephew's in the front row, just so you know. He's a very, very good friend of mine. And so I didn't know what that meant. I knew he was an archbishop. To kind of give a little bit of context, my father's a Southern Baptist minister. So I don't know the formal terms. I would look up on Google, how do you approach an archbishop? What do you say to an archbishop? All of these kind of things, to just try to figure how to fit in. I've got zero diplomatic experience. And so spending time with him, I didn't know what that meant. And when I landed in Syria, I was slated to go to Syria in February of 2006. 2 days after the Danish cartoonist released his cartoon and inflamed the Arab world. And so the Archbishop called me and said, hey, I'm sorry, you can't come. It's not safe. I can't guarantee your safety. It's like, well, when do you think I could come? He's like, I don't know. And so, I canceled everything, had to reschedule flights, and told my wife, I don't think it's going to happen. Project's over, and then as things go in the Mideast, tension settled in 10 days. And he was like, okay, you can come tomorrow. I was like, okay. So I called the travel agent, can I go tomorrow? Is that a possibility? He's like, yeah. So I got on the plane. And the point of the story is this is what my confrontation, on landing, no one was at the airport. And I cannot speak Arabic. I didn't have a phone. The only phone number I had was the Archbishop's cell phone. And I didn't realize he was such a sought-after major political figure at the time. And so I'm calling his cell phone, and no one's answering. And I have one other number that was maybe his office, and no one was in his office, and he's not answering phone. He was just at the airport for a while. And it was because he was on television with the Grand Mufti, the head of Islam for Syria, denouncing the uprising and kind of trying to calm the public. And I just felt completely misled on where I was traveling to. At that time, Syria was put on the axis of evil, around that month, I think. So it was all I knew was I was going to this dictatorship where it was going to be insane, and I was just confronted with just a completely different image of that. And so my time with the Archbishop was just example after example after example, these amazing relationships that existed outside of politics and outside of religion in a way that I just completely didn't know existed. And one of the things I've struggled with in dealing with all of this is that something I was hoping for and witnessed, or was that the reality of how it worked? Now, Obviously, it's not like that all the time. But one of the albums, and I'll talk about this later, I did an Armenian album about some chanting, and the head Armenian scholar for the United States said the exact same thing when I met him. He went to Syria to meet with the head of the Armenian community, and they were going to go visit the great mosque in Damascus. There's a photo of it in the other room. And he was going to take off all of his garments, and the Archbishop was like, no, leave them on, we will be welcome. And he said he was so angry upon leaving Syria that he was misled his entire life on how his people would be treated, that he just couldn't handle it, essentially. It's like digesting all these extremely complex relationships in the face of just not ever knowing that they existed was really difficult. Not difficult, it was completely engaging and really hard to kind of come to terms with after a 10-day immersion on my first trip.
I think your story is a great example of how an initiative of creative storytelling gets overtaken by current events or by politics, and that the creative community is not separate by any means from the realities of the world, does not exist in a bubble, and in fact is shaped and reshaped by it. And this is a perfect example of that, and that relates to my final question for you, which is, your work focuses on kind of daily life, and there's a wall of portraits, which I think is very powerful over there, and storefronts. But at what point, when you look at it, you don't necessarily think this is politically significant. But at what point did you realize you had something that you had to share, and you felt compelled to share it? And what do you want the folks here today to get out of these images?
So I've been working on this book on the city of Aleppo for now 10 years. And when the war kicked in, and let me define that as when it went from small to as it started to escalate, I started to get Facebook ads. So you like Syria? Like all this advertising started to show up with like everything that I've been dealing with it for so many years that I shut down and stopped working on everything. One, I couldn't handle it. And then I did not want to take advantage. No one cared. I was only there to try to do this thing, and it was no one really knew where I was going, and I was off doing something else again in this wild place. Before Syria, I was going to the depths of Peru, and it was another place that I was going, and no one really cared about what I was doing, except if you were from not even religious, because most Protestants could care less. To sum that sentence up, I was on the plane going to make these recordings next to a mid-20s Protestant evangelical church going to save people in Greece. And they were like, what are you doing? I was like, I'm going, trying to not really engage, but I was like, I'm going to Syria, and they're like, oh, what are you doing? He's like, I'm gonna go record the world's earliest Christian chanting. In this church group, they were like, well, that's neat. And I was like, it is kind of neat, there's a lot of other adjectives that could be said, and that's where the conversation started and ended. It was just kind of whatever. And so I just sat on, not all of my photographs, but none of my recordings. It was sitting on a hard drive at my house, and then everything just got worse and worse and worse, and I just couldn't, I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know how to handle it, and I was just like, this is insane. And then a friend of mine called. He was like, dude, what are you doing with your entire archive? I was like, right now, nothing. He was like, you should do something with it. I was like what? He He was like, you've got all this info. And at the time, I was like, I've got a book in production. I have an album with the Smithsonian Institute. Like, that's good enough. He's like, but you don't have a date for any of that. And everything that you've worked on for the past however long is all over the news. Like, you could provide a perspective for at least your friends on what we're actually dealing with. And so I was like, well, fine. What do you suggest I do? And he was like, you should put out some other records. And I was like, fine. So I went to my house, and I hadn't listened to any of these recordings since I made them, and which was at that point 3 or 4 years prior. And I had a whole series worth of albums that I professionally recorded. I brought like a mobile studio with me. And then I had a talk with my wife, and I was like, look, I think I want to try to actually do my own record label and put out these other recordings to just raise awareness for the cultural pieces. And so, like, in a little bit, like, I'll show you some of the records that I did. So the first one I did was this Sufi album, and I had no clue if anyone would care. Like, I had no clue if, and they cost a lot of money to make, and fortunately I have a job. So I was like, I'm gonna spend all this money to produce these things. It cost like 10 grand, not knowing if it would sell or not sell. Selling it was not the point. It's the metaphor of having something to show. And then, being that I'm a musician, people gravitate towards what they're comfortable in doing, right? Like, with all of this, like, my thing is like, I'm do like art. And then, all the other panelists like to deal with all the different issues people do with what they're familiar with. So I hired a publicist, like a world music publicist. I didn't even know what that meant. And then they, sent it to all these places. And then, to my utter shock, the album was like on Billboard. And all of a sudden, like, NPR and all these different places, like, there was interest. But with the interest came knowledge. And then, so I kind of started to reform my, like, that is when I realized, like, what I had. And I tell this story often because it was unbelievably embarrassing, but really humbling moment. Like, I've done a series of television interviews, and I did something at Al Jazeera, and fortunately, since I had done something before, she said, the producer was like, be in the lobby at 3:45 or something. And then I was literally on air at 3:55. Like, I had 10 minutes. I didn't get to use the bathroom or anything. And so she came in, set up, and then went afterwards and was walking around, and she was like, this is the cultural hero I was explaining. It's like, hold on a second. Like, that's really heavy-handed, and it's really nice, but it's really uncomfortable for you and me. Like, and then she brought me into another room, and she was like, look, I know this was an accident. I know you don't really understand the weight of some of your stuff, but I produced this television network, and you need to understand that this has larger value than what you understand. And that was kind of like I said, yes, ma'am, I'm sorry. But it was like that moment with the woman from Al Jazeera, and then all of this other context when people would like email me like, oh, I heard some of the music, and started corresponding with me over it.
There's a portion of the exhibit that has images that Jason took and of the time he was there, so of peacetime, and then there's an update of what happened in 2016, and then we also have given a short update of 2018. A lot of the things that you're going to see in his work are gone. They're destroyed. The wall of portraits of people, children, elderly, young men and women, we don't know if they're alive or not, right? And you'll see the statistics of how many people are gone. And so there is most definitely a lot of depth in kind of these images of peacetime. And they're very meaningful to those of us who work on it from a policy perspective, no doubt. And so I wanted to talk with Farah a little bit. She's an analyst and a filmmaker, and she's worked extensively on Syria, was an advisor at the Embassy of Syria here in Washington, before the war started or right up through. But she also has a personal connection to Aleppo. And she's a perfect example of this interdisciplinary-minded individual who wants to kind of advocate for a certain kind of policy impact, which is why I'm so happy she's here with us today. But talk about your experience with Aleppo, and I'd especially be interested in how you characterize the impact of the war on the culture and the history and the personal narratives of people who know Aleppo.
Sure. Well, before, when people would ask me where am I from originally, because apparently I don't look like I'm from here, I would say Syria. And they would say, where's that? Do you speak Farsi? No, I don't. Today, when people ask me where I'm from originally, and I say Syria, Aleppo, Syria, they say, I'm sorry. So you see, in between going from those who don't know where to locate Syria on the map to I'm sorry are significant gaps of understanding about the people, the culture, the history, even the policy lost along the way. And so I'm really grateful that we have an event like this in an attempt to sort of fill those gaps, so to speak. As for me, before I ever stepped foot onto Syrian and Aleppo soil, I knew about Syria through my parents growing up in a suburb in Southern California. I learned about the food, the music, because there is a very significant Syrian diaspora community there, along with other diaspora communities in California. So I already sort of had a sense of possibly what Syria in my mind could be. My parents left Aleppo when they were pretty young. My mom left when she was 14, and my dad when he was 17. But nonetheless, they always kept Syria close to them, and that was something that they made sure my siblings and I always knew where we came from, and to take pride in it. And I say that especially not for nationalistic reasons, but growing up, being, the only Arab in my school or the only Muslim in my school. I remember after the Gulf War, definitely being teased mercilessly, and my communities also experienced that post 9/11. So it was always really empowering and important to me as a hyphenated Arab American, Syrian American, to know that there was always this place that I could call home, so to speak. And my family would also maintain the traditions by telling the stories of our family in Syria. So for example, my paternal grandfather was the head of his tribe. He came from a desert town near Palmyra, and testifying to the importance of local tribal politics, which is why I share this and which is still important in understanding Syria today. Politicians would come to my grandpa because they needed votes. So, for example, Nazim al-Utsi, one of the presidents from 1961 to 63, would come to my grandfather and ask for votes. Another story that I grew up hearing all the time was my mom's experience. She was born in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, but for her, her family came to Aleppo when she was about 5 years old. And one of her formative experiences was attending this French Catholic school. And it was extremely important for her because her classmates were Muslim, they were Catholic, they were Jewish. And so she went to school with religious minorities who didn't even identify or call themselves religious minorities. And that was the Aleppo that she grew up in, and it's particularly poignant for her because her family left at the end of 1963. The Ba'athist coup was in March of 63, and her father had absolutely feared what would happen to the country. It was a period of instability. It wasn't a period of the war that we know now, but there was that consideration for Syrians during that time. Do we stay? Do we go? Her father decided that they would leave, and so they returned to Saudi Arabia. So you can imagine for my mom to go from that, attending that kind of school, learning that, of course, there's this religious pluralism. That's part of the culture. So to go from there to Saudi Arabia, let's just say it was dramatically different. I mean, she's grateful that she learned every line of the Quran in Saudi Arabia, but there were other things that were very different from her life, such as going to the movie theaters, which she did often in Aleppo, and grew up watching Psycho and El Cid and The Wizard of Oz right from Aleppo. And so, I would hear these stories from my family to center me on Aleppo, but I didn't make my first trip to Aleppo and to the rest of Syria until the summer of 2003, where I joined a very small, low-budget film crew, and we made a 30-minute documentary film. And the purpose really was to give insights on the sights and sounds of Syria, particularly for an American audience that wasn't aware of Syria, either its rich past or even its, let's say, modern political, socioeconomic challenges. And so with our crew, we had a chance to travel all throughout the country. I mean, I'll just share some anecdotes. For example, we shot a barber in the town of Malula, northeast of Damascus, giving someone a buzz cut, all while speaking in Aramaic. I had never seen anything like that before. We followed the acclaimed Syrian filmmaker Hamad Malas to the city of Unetra on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. His family knew war intimately because in '67, the city was destroyed. And when we went, it still continues to be in rubble. And he would speak about how that was a formative time for him, and it inspired him to become a filmmaker. And I can't help but wonder, potentially, this new generation of Syrian filmmakers who will be able to talk and discuss what they left behind, and that's something that we'll learn more about in years to come. And one of the other places we went to in Syria, I think speaking to its complexity, is this Palestinian refugee camp, Jaramana, which is near Damascus. And there were some, at the time, there were maybe 5,000 Palestinian refugees there who had fled the Arab-Israeli wars in '48 and '67. And that was particularly meaningful to me because here I was listening to Palestinians dream about returning to a home of their own, to realize the right to return to the home of their own. And here I was, I got to realize that, and they didn't. And so today when we talk about the refugee crisis, I would just note, based on my numerous trips there, that there already in Syria was some 500,000 Palestinian refugees after the invasion of Iraq, which is when we were there, to really capture the fact that Syrians were rattled and felt potentially that the war could extend to Syria. And so there were Iraqi refugees in Syria, nearly 1 million, 1.5 million. And so that's also been part of the Syrian experience. But just to wrap it up, aside from working on that project, I sort of took my own personal journey off camera when the battery died, so to speak. And I traveled through Aleppo specifically to retrace my family's steps, to learn where did my dad grow up, where did my mom go to school. So I would walk through the old souk in Aleppo, which has been damaged by the war. I would go to the great mosque, which has also been damaged by the war. That's where my dad first forged his Muslim identity. And while I was appreciative of the fact that I could reminisce and hold on to these memories, I was also keenly aware of the real political problems on the ground that would eventually surface to the point of the war in 2011. For example, the home where my mom grew up, I learned was Mukhabarat, or secret police headquarters. So in other words, that place where she used to play the piano and dream would also be used after she left to torture, to detain, to arrest. And so on the one hand, balancing nostalgia with, of course, the political realities, the issues that need to be addressed. I don't think I appreciated that as much until I was there. And I would continue to visit Syria anyway between 2004 and 2006. And really to sum up and to speak to Aleppo today is just how blown away I was, not only by the resiliency, the humor, the compassion, and the industrious nature of the people that I met, but the fact that even through war that still exists, and I'm sure Lena can talk more about it through her great work, but even within refugee camps, Syrians are still surviving.
I think, Farah, you're a good example of how the diaspora can play a critical role in carrying on some of the historical narrative of these communities, which have physically been destroyed, but in terms of the memory and the stories of people, it still very much exists. And one final question on that for you, and then I'd like to turn to Lena, is what's your kind of experience within the diaspora of their involvement in kind of the current situation, and either specifically on Aleppo or on Syria? And this is something that I know quite well. I'm from Toledo, Ohio, which has one of the largest kind of Syrian diasporas in the country as well. And there are waves of refugees that have created this immigrant community. And some people just came to come, but it's not necessarily a foreign narrative that your homeland goes through a conflict and you move past it or it impacts you. I mean, we've seen this before, right?
Right. And interesting fact too, even before the war, the number of Syrian expatriates was around 15 million. This is a country of 22 million with 15 million living outside the country for various reasons. I mean, that number has gone up since the war, but that just sort of tells you just how many Syrian expatriates are outside the country. And as for the diaspora and their involvement at the moment, I mean, there are certainly things that can be done for the short and medium term, and we've seen it through doctors, through philanthropists, through activists, volunteering in Syria, providing crucial, much needed humanitarian aid, including the work that Lena does. And then there's also that need, of course, for the long term. And it may be premature to discuss it now, but there is that question, because wars do end, and there is that question of what a post-war Syria can or should look like, and what kind of role the Syrian diaspora can play. I mean, certainly there are already, even through the war, Syrian grassroots organizations on the ground that will need and could benefit from more support, collaboration, knowledge sharing. That's something that can be done. And then for me, especially since I've completed my law degree and I very much think about returning back to Syria, I'm really thinking about, I hope one day, a constitution, a new constitution, in a process that doesn't mirror the recent experience in Egypt, for example, which was one where there was a constituent assembly that was dominated by one political party, the Muslim Brotherhood, that was doomed to fail, especially because it didn't include the perspective of the Coptic Christian minority. And so, again, it may seem premature now to even talk about it, but we have to talk about this crucial document. And I would just point, not to say that it has to be a Syrian document, of course, and one approved and consulted by Syrians, but there are also examples, best practices, including in Tunisia, where consensus was a crucial aspect in formulating their latest constitution, or even in South Africa, where it was a two-stage sort of process that involved a lot of consensus and negotiation. And we know there is that big question, too, of the president and transition, but this is probably not the place for it here to really go into it.
We've had plenty of events at SAIS on
Sure.
The new constitution is the subject of the news this week as well, and I think you can't ignore the fact that regional and international actors will also have some hand in those conversations, for better or for worse, obviously. So more to come on that.
Sure.
So Lena, thank you for joining us all the way from the Chicago suburbs.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. And some of you may have seen Lena in a short New York Times film a couple weeks ago or last week, and about Aleppo, and in which she discusses her kind of family's connection to the place, and also introduces some issues of rebuilding and how you begin that process. And she's an architect by training, but she also has her own foundation, which does humanitarian assistance for Syrian refugees all over the world, which I think is, again, another good example of a member of the diaspora remaining connected to what's happening back home. So before we get into these issues of rebuilding, I'd actually would like you to talk about your last trip to Aleppo, which you talk a little bit about in the film. It reminds me of Farah's story of going back and kind of looking at remnants of the family's past.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me, and sorry I was late. I was actually born in New York City. My parents are both from Aleppo, like Farah's parents. And when they came in the early 70s, my parents are both doctors, and like many, many, many Syrian doctors, probably people in this room have had a Syrian doctor, even if you don't know that. Because all of them leave. And they came in the early 70s because they wanted to have a better future for themselves. And I was born here like my brothers. And when I was 12 years old, we were living in upstate New York. My father actually did his residency at GW, so close to here, and my mother at Johns Hopkins. So, and when they built up their private practice in a very small town in upstate New York, I went to a private Catholic school. Our town had one stoplight, and at 12 years old, my father said, "Okay, we're moving back to Aleppo." And so I moved back, and I lived that first year with my grandmother while they were here, selling the practices and selling their house, so I could catch up with my Arabic. And I went straight into 7th grade and to military school in the police state, and that was a big culture shock. And that's where kind of the split for me that I think Jason and Farah definitely they're talking about is that Syria and Aleppo, for me, I mean, I can trace back my family many generations. Our ancestor came from Mosul, my father says, in the 11th century to Aleppo, and they can go back all of these names and actually trace where they lived, which is in this photograph over here in Bab Nisreen. So we're very, very, very deeply rooted, but at the same time, I was an American teenager, and you go there and you're wearing a military uniform and you have to do and say things that you don't even understand, and you live in a culture of fear. And I think that people don't understand that, yes, when you're living in certain, like an economic class, you actually don't walk around all day in a police state being afraid for your life. You actually see a lot of beauty, you have a lot of access, you have a lot of privilege, but it's there, and there's certain things that nobody, no matter where you are on that social ladder, you cannot cross until now. So that split between the love of the family, love of history, the really close relationship I had with my grandmother that I write about a lot and I talk about a lot, is always balanced by you really don't want to live in Syria under this regime, because the prospects for your life, for your future, if you're not a doctor or an engineer that's able to leave and come back and live as an expat or visit, then you really don't have that much of a future, which is why we saw in 2011 what happened is because that all bubbled over and the revolution began against the Syrian regime. So I lived in Syria from 7th grade, went through high school, went to University of Aleppo for architecture, graduated, and then I came back to the States because I told my father, I'm not going to live in Syria. I have to go back to America. And then this is where I live. I live in Chicago with my family. And I started Karam actually in 2007. It was not related to Syria. Karam means generosity in Arabic, and it was, inspired by my father's love of charity that he used to do a lot in Aleppo. Until today, he does it from afar. And I felt that we should be doing more as, Arab Americans, doing more in really innovative charity and giving outside of our own circles. And they used to call Karam Foundation, this organization that didn't have a cause, and that always used to bother me. Then in 2011, the cause came to us in the most tragic way, and we had to learn how to become a really serious organization working on this crisis. We're in a conflict zone that was our own homeland, that was soon to become the largest humanitarian crisis of our lifetime. So all of this we were not prepared for. Nobody was prepared for this at all. And as an architect and as a person from Aleppo, in 2011, the revolution had not arrived to Aleppo. And my parents still lived there at the time. And so I went alone that summer after spending every summer in Aleppo with my family and with my children. I went back in 2011 for 2 weeks alone. And that was the last time I went to the city. And I was the only cousin out of all of my cousins who live in the United States to go back that summer. Everybody was like, why are you going back? The revolution is going to be over in a few months. Is this me?
Maybe put it on the table next to you.
Yes, sorry. Okay, yeah,
It's
sorry
you.
about that. Yeah, I think it's this cord. And so people thought that it was going to end. That's how everybody thought everything was going to end. Thought we were going to see Egypt, we were going to see Tunisia, and nobody expected what was to happen. I went back and I really spent a lot of time with my family, with my grandmother in her home. I photographed everything in her home, and I knew that it was going to be goodbye. I saw my friends. The city still felt safe. It was on edge. It was very strange to go to Friday lunch in the old city in one of the boutique restaurants, and literally on Al Jazeera we're seeing these massive protests in Hama, which is like an hour and 15-minute drive. So it was very surreal. And then I came back, and after that, all of my work has been working in the IDP camps. First time I've ever seen a refugee camp. What's going on here, and then we started working with Syrian refugees on the border. We work now with refugees in Turkey, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in the United States. I never imagined that we would have this reality, but it is our reality. And since I got to this seat here, just looking at that photograph, I can't tell you. You look at this and you see an old city in a very beautiful form, but for people from Aleppo, thank you.
He's also an AV
this.
guy.
Yes. Every single, like one of those 4 tents in the front, each one of them is a separate cafe. And we used to go try them out and see which one is better than the next, even though they look exactly the same. And behind that L-shaped, that's Khan el-Shune. I know every single store inside. We know the guy. There's a building in the back there, behind that mosque. That was the most famous place to buy rotisserie chicken.
I think his portraits.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, when we, just to go back to the separation between the love of the country and the love of family and the love of architecture and all the beauty that's Aleppo and that's actually all of Syria, and this disconnect between this regime is that Aleppo was neglected, like the professor was speaking about. And I wrote a paper about that at MIT in 2002. because Aleppo experienced a cultural massacre separate than the massacre of Hama in 1982. And so it was neglected. So this, you wouldn't have seen this in the 90s. You would have seen an old city that was covered in garbage, that nobody knew what was going on there. We went to the citadel and left, and all of this reconstruction process actually happened in the late 90s and in the 2000s under Bashar al-Assad, supported by the German government, supported by the Aga Khan, that I studied under at MIT. And so all of these plans that happened in the revitalization of old Aleppo happened under we were like the soldiers of it, the architecture students in urban planning. They cut up the map of Aleppo, the old city, into segments, and we had different teams. And so we had 2 different areas where I went with 5 of my friends, and we went into every single home asking about who lives here, how many kids, who works, what are these houses used for? Are these houses crumbling on the heads of their families because they weren't allowed to actually fix their homes because they're antiquities? And those maps got translated into more official maps that at the end created this beautiful revitalized old city, which was an amazing thing to experience up until 2011 to 13, 14, until it started getting destroyed. And then in an instant, after all of these, probably billions of dollars, all of this effort, really getting awards, and it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, being bombed in an instant with barrel bombs, with chemical weapons, with all kinds of different weapons that you can imagine over its people. The city separating into east and west, which we never knew before. People from Aleppo don't know an east and west. It's all one city. To see that happen in instant turning is the most heartbreaking thing you can ever imagine. I mean, we suffer from a real genocide in Syria, and we suffered in Aleppo a cultural genocide.
And this skyline is very much damaged now, right, Jason?
Yeah. So to kind of explain why I did this is a near to scale vision of this skyline. Like if like afterwards when we're done, if you stand in the middle, this is the citadel. I have it tattooed on my arm. I'm standing here and shooting out over the city. That large mosque in the middle is gone. That hotel, like basically everything in the foreground is gone. And it's gut-wrenching. And like Farah's father, his neighborhood was back on the left. The guy with the rotisserie chicken, you see a row of cars, his chicken spot's right there. This is the Great Mosque. That minaret on the left, this blue photo, that minaret was brought, you can watch on YouTube, that thing getting shot down. It was 1,100 years old. Then first I think the place got burnt, and then that got leveled. In the back, on the right-hand side, that is the ancient synagogue of Aleppo, allegedly built by King David's general, the foundation, and then the current building. It's the oldest continuous use building in Aleppo, meaning it's never changed usage. It's 1,600 years old. And just yesterday, I was on Google Maps trying to figure out how much of this, if I could come up with a percentage of like how much of this is gone, like 80% or whatever. I found the person that took the photo didn't know what the building was. That image right there is totally gone. There was just a photograph, like a 360 street view of that just removed, and all of the stones were packed in the middle. When you walk out, there's a photo of the courtyard of the synagogue on like right at the entrance. All of the stones from the building are stacked up in the middle of the building. So hopefully at some point, things could get rebuilt with the stones. There's a rumor that the stones from the minaret got saved as well.
So Lena, walk us through the future process to rebuild, given the level of destruction that we've seen. Who are the stakeholders involved in that kind of process? What kinds of questions would need to be asked? who might be involved?
So I think that we hear a lot, for probably the past year or so, we hear a lot about reconstruction, not just of Aleppo, of Syria. And I think that it's very disingenuous to even be talking about reconstruction of a country when people are dying every single day, and we're seeing forced displacement of tens of thousands of people right now from eastern Ghouta outside Damascus to northern Syria. We might see now an onslaught against northern Syria in the Idlib province, where the regime has kind of thrown everybody up there that has been outside of the besieged areas. And then so to have these kinds of conferences or talks that we're seeing, or even political negotiations talking about reconstruction, the question that I always think about is who are we reconstructing this country for? Because over 5.5 million Syrians are refugees outside the country, and over 6.5 million Syrians are internally displaced, meaning many of those are in the IDP camps or in border zones very far away from their homes. And we've had city cores, Aleppo, Homs, Daraa, Deir ez-Zor, many towns and other cities as well that have been almost completely leveled. So the infrastructure is completely destroyed. And who's going to be actually even doing that or paying for that? So I think that just talking about reconstruction, I think we will see projects such as rebuilding the minaret or rebuilding a certain part of old Aleppo, a certain part of Homs for certain people. But it's very, very tragic because the actual stakeholders are no longer in the picture, and Syrians in general really no longer have a say in what will happen in the future. So it is very, very bleak. And I think that people should really think about that. Just because we don't see Syria on the news doesn't mean people aren't being killed every day and they're not dying for unnecessary reasons. This is still happening. And the refugee question becomes as big as a part of reconstruction as the actual country, because what will happen with the refugee youth, the education piece, people finding jobs, people actually building up their lives. It's a tragedy on a very mass scale.
Indeed. So what we'd like to do now is turn it over to Jason, who will give us a musical presentation and talk a bit more about that. And afterwards, we will open it up for a brief Q&A, followed by a reception. So you will get to ask questions, but I'm going to turn it over to Jason now for some music.
So I'm gonna play a very short chant. This is from that extremely ancient Christian tradition, which in and of itself, it's a Syriac community who were also refugees into Syria during the Armenian Holocaust of World War I. They're not Armenian, and the Syrian Orthodox get frustrated with the term Armenian Holocaust. They call it Sipho, which means the sword. So the two records that have been out, I'm going to describe why I do them. You can find these on every streaming service on the planet, but also I do these things on record because in a day of streaming, and when basically culture is bought and sold and it's whatever, I wanted to provide something. There's a lot of metaphor that goes into all this. So for this one, my friend took these photographs. My friend's named Khalid Akil. Like, his family was the governor of Aleppo like 500 years ago, and like they trace their roots like really deep. I wanted to choose something that for an American audience would be frightening. Like, this looks menacing, it's Islamic, but everything related to this is about poetry, it's about love, it's the complete opposite of what someone would really think. And so for every album, there has to be, so this group called themselves Nawa. They were kind of a rogue Sufi group that were practicing in the courtyard of a 500-year-old house. And my friend's great-grandfather was the head of their Sufi organization, for lack of a better term. Remember, I am not a scholar. And so they kind of vouched for me, and they let me come in and make this recording. This is the first time they'd ever let a Westerner see them or hear them. And so Nawa is the name of their group. And then for the covers, for all these records, there has to be native script. And I make these so they're all gatefold, which means if you have any interest in this, you have to physically hold it and you have to open it up. You have to have enough interest to actually open it and look into it. And then there's a map on the inside that has highlighted whatever cities make sense related to the tradition that's being discussed. And then there's either a scholar, this was the very first one I did, and I could not find, on the planet, I couldn't find a Sufi expert to really make it digestible enough for someone that doesn't know anything about Sufism to be able to have like an entrance point. So I make these as cultural artifacts. So if anyone that lived in Syria would be like, oh, I know this church. It's by like the amazing restaurant I used to eat at all the time. Which it is, like these amazing restaurants in the Armenian quarter. You would go by the 40 Martyrs Church. And so I did this first, and I did this one second. The third, there's 5 in total. I have one with Smithsonian Folkways that should come out next year, and a Chaldean one, and then one from the Syrian Orthodox Church. I have 2 from the Syrian Orthodox Church. So one of the things that I kind of wanted to talk about is how this skyline is this iconic skyline. There's so much history that goes involved with that. The Armenians were marched in that courtyard where all of those tents are, cataloged and marched off in the desert and then killed off in the genocide. Like those genocide, a large portion of the Armenian genocide happened in the deserts of Syria. I don't know any of this information until I start working on the actual albums themselves. And then I recruit scholars to kind of help pull it all together. And when I alluded to this Armenian scholar. And so when I went to go meet with him, one, I want to make sure the recordings I have, are they actual recordings? Like, do they represent the church? Do they represent the culture? Do they represent the people that allegedly did the recordings for me? I don't know enough about the communities or the intricacies of each separate practice to know if they would be valid. So I have someone validate the recordings and then come up with kind of what are the liner notes about. And when I went to go have this meeting, this was in end of 2014, things started to get really bad in Aleppo. And he had just translated an Armenian poem from 1946. 1946, the Soviets tried to entice the Armenians to come back to Armenia to repopulate it, and there was a name for Nerkakt, the reparation to Soviet Armenia. And so there was a guy who, him and his 3 brothers survived the genocide. Everyone else was killed off. And so his 2 brothers moved back to Armenia, and he struggled with whether or not he should leave Aleppo. And so he wrote a poem about his Aleppo. This is from 1947 that perfectly narrates where we are now. And it's called Farewell Aleppo. So on the album itself, I actually have this picture, and then I'm going to read the poem for you now, and then I'll play a chant. You are an Arab city, my honorable birthplace. My eyes opened and I saw you. I knew there was no other city. My second fatherland with your Syrian people. You became the good protector to the Armenian. You gave us bread and shelter. We have always lived together as brothers, Armenian to Arab. We have worked always together as Assyria without guile. The day of our separation is near. O altar of the light of my childhood. We shall ever remember you, O altar of the hope of my childhood. Etch me as in's carillon ring out, calling her children to her. I am parting from you with love, city of Aleppo, farewell. And I find it the perfect metaphor for everything related to everything that we've been talking about. So I'm going to end, or we are going to end, I'm going to play a chant. This was recorded in 2010. This is one of the last things I ever did in Syria. The gentleman that did this was in his 70s. And in 2010, I started to have some serious political issues, meaning I had problems with the military. And so this guy, I would like to kind of spend my time. I interviewed him. I was like, what on this album for Folkways was your favorite chant? He's like, oh, we didn't do my favorite one. I was like, what? I have known you for 5 years. Why did not record your favorite chant? He's like, I'm the only one that knows how to do it. I can't really sing it anymore, and it's I just can't do it. And I have all of this on video. It's like, you have to record it. You're the only human on the planet that knows how to do this prayer. We have to do it. It's the perfect metaphor for why I'm here. And it was like back and forth, and he wouldn't do it. And then I noticed he had a bottle in his back shelf of arak, which is the spirit. And I was like, what if I came back with like a full bottle of arak and we just took the whole thing out and then you chanted? And he was like, what? I was like, get hammered and chant this thing. And he's like, okay. And he agreed. And so I got crazy sick, like super, super sick.
We're going to edit that part out of the video, by the way.
But I got super sick. You know, I came over, I had a bottle. We never drank. Like, it was just like, that was what he needed. He needed some excuse to do it one last time. Like, I set up all the microphones and everything, and then he did it. And what you're going to hear, this is the last time this prayer was ever done. And then the war started 5 months later, and here we go. So if you want, so what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of dim the lights for a little ambiance. With everything that we've got going on, I just wanted to have kind of like a moment of solitude and reflection of everything that we've all been kind of talking about, and then we'll go and kind of go over photographs in the lobby and everything else. So I recorded that and then packed my stuff, and I went home literally the next day. And then 5 weeks later, I got a call from a friend/interpreter that he died on my wedding anniversary. And so that was literally the last time that it was ever performed. One of the things I kind of wanted to go over, this collection of images, I literally have 20,000 photographs in the city of Aleppo. This is a small fraction. And the way things are kind of compartmentalized here, this room was obviously, I wanted to put some larger things to draw your attention in, and I knew these would be spoken about. There is a wall of portraits. Some of the people are famous, some of the people have been abducted, some of the people have been executed, and some people we just don't know. And I didn't put any information about that because I wanted you to look, and it's accompanied by a list of terrible statistics of these are the faces of these statistics. This is literally the face of this terrible set of numbers. The back room, I did a photo exhibit 2 years ago in New York, and that is that exhibit from New York. It was the 10th anniversary of my first trip to Syria. It highlighted my time with the Christian community. I highly encourage you to read the captions. The captions are from 2016, and then below it, we did it with SICE, like kind of an update of what is happening now, 2018. And then the other images are just some like kind of general shots of different parts of the country from my various trips.
Thank you, Jason. I know you're probably eager to go see the work, but I would like to give a little bit of time for all of you to ask some questions. So we'll maybe take 10 minutes or so to do some Q&A. When you ask your question, please introduce yourself, your affiliation, be brief. And we have mic runners, so back there, this gentleman in the scarf.
Hi. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ahmed Bitar, and my affiliation, I'm from Aleppo, and I arrived recently. I'm not going to be that long. I don't know if I should be happy or sad, cry or laugh, because like a lot of memories, this photo is like at least 5 or 6 of those places were destroyed for many reasons. I would like to thank you all before I burst in tears because like so much emotional. I arrived 4 years ago, so it's part of my childhood, adulthood, and everything. I don't want to end up like it's much more a question like a request because I don't want to end up on the sad notes because everyone here I think are full of emotion, and we will go there and we will see a lot of also bad memories. So I'm gonna ask each one of the guests very simple question, like if you want to summarize your experience in Aleppo or what like the best memory you ever have, what would be at least that everyone knows how the city was and how it would be hopefully again, instead of like crying now and tears for what's going on, because my family's still there, and from what I'm hearing, there is the will to rebuild the city and bring it back again. We just hope, all of us, that the war is end and we had better people ruling us, and some people who believe that, and that how great was Syria and how great was Aleppo. So I would like to have some of your thoughts as people who were born and raised here and been there for a part of their life.
It's a lovely question. Can we start with Lena?
Start with Lena, but I want to explain how he and I met.
Yeah. You have
really
a story
quick.
with everyone of how you met. That's true. We would be here until next week if we did that.
His close friend was the violinist whose grandfather was the guy that let me in with the Sufis. We met. He came to my house. I was like, oh, dude, you should see all these photos from Syria. The first one I showed him was of his brother. and he was standing right behind me. He was like, dude, that means I was standing right behind you in the photograph. And so, he's amazing.
That's great.
He has my back. My brother's dead, so I recognize him and realize that he took my back.
Well, there's one of our panelists couldn't make it, Salwan Georges. He's a photographer, and he himself is a Iraqi refugee who lived in Aleppo in the church that Jason was working at, and at the same time, I think. So it's clearly a very small community. Lena, please.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it's hard to get over the fact also, for people who are not from Aleppo, all you can see really is the citadel, even before the war, when people would come, it's all about, let's go to the citadel, let's see the historic sites, but people really wouldn't get the feel for really what Aleppo is. And emotions, all of the emotions that Ahmed is talking about is true. We feel so much sadness and sorrow and pain, and also nostalgia, and sometimes we feel very happy when we see something good coming out of this tragedy, and it's always this roller coaster. And for me, after the fall of Aleppo, I really couldn't cry for the whole time I was watching it fall. And you become also, the media wants to call you and ask you questions about what do you think about this and what do you think about that, and become this political analyst on the fall of your own home city. And then I wrote about this, actually. I couldn't write about it for a whole year. I wrote about it, that I started to cry on Christmas Day of 2016 after the fall, because I woke up to the news that George Michael had died. And I couldn't stop crying, because if I had to describe happy memories of Aleppo, it's the music of, the pop music of the 80s and the 90s, and George Michael and Spice Girls blasting out of my car. Because with freedom really in Syria, especially if you're a girl, like a teenager and a young woman, you really are not free anywhere except when you're in your car, if you're lucky enough to have a car, which I was. And then I'd go out with my friends and you just go around and around and around the city. And that's when because there's no phones, there's no place to hang out, and you don't have your parents nearby you, and we would play the music, and we would go and buy all of this music because we weren't listening to the chants in the churches. We would go out and buy all of the music. And so that is real happiness. And I think that's what I want the kids that we work with, with Karam, the refugees. I think that these parts of Syria are lost on kids who are growing up as refugees, especially in conservative areas where they don't actually know how diverse and how beautiful. They don't even know the Aleppo that I speak to them about. And that's, I'm a memory of a city to them, because I can tell them all day long that it didn't matter which religion you were, it didn't matter what sect you were, all of these things didn't matter, because those don't translate to them as truth, because that's not what they've known their entire lives growing up under war. So my hope is that one day we can bring that back to the kids, for them to understand that kind of beauty of the people of Aleppo. And I will stop.
One of my favorite memories, just aside from this beautiful and sometimes crazy and sometimes contradictory coexistence of old and new. You see, donkeys. You see going through the old zoo. Then you see someone with a Hummer, whizzing right by, and then hearing the pop music as well. Right outside the citadel, old and new, constantly coexisting. But a specific memory I have is I wanted to buy an oud, an instrument, and there was this man who was well known for making them. I think his name was Abu Ibrahim. I couldn't tell you the exact spot where in Halab his shop was, but my aunts, my cousins, many of whom I was meeting for the first time, all came with me to go and buy an oud. And we go to the warehouse and we see this man with the most beautiful handcrafted instruments, the ouds you've ever seen. I mean, growing up in Southern California, go to Guitar Center, go on Craigslist, get your instrument. So to be able to go to this craftsman who took great pride, even the pearl inlay on the oud, and describing the story and having different names for each instrument. I mean, that for me very much personifies, epitomizes just the pride that people in Aleppo take, that we don't have to have chain stores everywhere to be modern or liberal. Yes, we need other serious institutional reforms, but even the fact that you could still take pride, in something ancient like an oud, that still moves me.
I'm trying to think of one moment. I had this just insane, being a total outsider. I'm not from Syria whatsoever. Got no blood ties, no nothing. I had just numerous wild stories, but one of my favorites was It was in 2010. I was photographing the old city, and I had gotten this tattoo. I had gotten this as a non-religious symbol to my time in Syria, and I'd been trying to get up in a minaret to photograph a skyline. And a friend of mine was walking me around, and we went into this mosque, and she was like, "Can we go up in the minaret?" And the guy was like, "No." And then she pulled up my sleeve, and it was an imam, looked at it, looked at his friend, and just said, in English, "Follow me." And then we walked, and I was like, "Are we actually going up?" And then he got on the loudspeakers, and in Arabic was like, "We have a special guest over the entire ancient city." And Bob Kennesreen. Yeah. He was like, "We have a special guest from Washington, D.C. I was like, "Oh my God." And he was like, "Women, cover or go inside. Men, be respectful," or something like that. He's going to take photographs in the minaret. I was like, "Oh my gosh." And then I got to go up and like photograph the old city from that like point of view, which is, you usually have to have military like permission to do things like that. And that it was one of my most fun, like, I can't believe this is actually happening moments in Syria.
That's so cool.
This woman in the middle, please.
Hi, I'm Najla Drubi. I'm Lebanese, Syrian. My father was from Homs. I was married to a guy from Aleppo. You cut his veins and he bleeds Aleppo. And I grew up, my kids grew up here and now they're the same way. Aleppo is in their blood, and I am much more hopeful, Lena, that we will go back to it, that Aleppo will go back to its origin. I know my mother-in-law, after all these years, is now trying to go back. She just wants her American citizenship, and she will go. So will the refugees that I work with on a daily basis. They just want peace there so that they can go back. My concern is how divided the refugees are here, how divided the Syrian community is here, and back home. We will not be able to rebuild unless we talk to each other, unless we stop talking about pro and against Bashar. So how can you, everyone on this team, help us get there, and what recommendations you have for us who are working with Syrians and with Americans and educate them every day?
Lena?
I agree with you. I think that we won't get anywhere without everybody speaking to each other, and refugees want to go home. All the refugees that I work with and the families, they want to go home. I want to go home. My parents want to go home. They had to leave in 2013, and I think that people have to find a way to find justice, because without justice there will be no peace. Truly. I think that we can all pretend that there will be peace, and there might be a short-term peace, or there might be peace for a portion of society, but there won't be true peace until people feel that they're able to live in their own cities and in their homes without fear. And so that's where I think that the idea, when we talk about reconstruction as just, another facade, another rebuilding, will we rebuild again and make it look like this again? Yes, we can do that. We did it before. But we don't need that. We need it to go back to, we don't need this regime to understand how to live together, because as these chants even are an example, and this architecture is an example, that we've lived together for thousands of years. We don't need this external force to say the protector of minorities, which we all know is not true. We need a government, and we need infrastructure that actually represents the people, all of the people, and everybody needs to speak to each other, you're right, and the people need to decide how they want to rule themselves, and this is what Syrians have wanted. And I think that can exist. I don't think that this is outside the realm of what Syrians can do, and their will and their resilience. If anything, the refugees show us how resilient and how their will to survive is. the Syrian people are very, very, very strong, and I have a lot of hope in the people. I don't have hope in the world, really. I think the world abandoned the country and the people and allowed this to continue. But I do think that with time we will be able to rebuild on our own terms. But it's going to take a lot of work.
I think I especially appreciate your question about the divided community, because it's something I've experienced myself as a Syrian American, especially when the uprising turned sectarian war started. I was working at the Syrian embassy in DC. I had started in 2010 and was there at the time. And you know, many of my colleagues, including myself, really represented a microcosm, if you will, of Syria, coming from different backgrounds, different religions. And in the beginning, we were all, as you might imagine, just waiting, seeing, trying to figure out what was happening. And I do remember there was a point in time where there was a Syrian community that wanted to come to the embassy to show their pride for the president. And I have to admit, I remember myself really wrestling with that question, because the violence was already escalating, and it was very clear that the regime wasn't going to respond peacefully, that more force was going to be used, even more so than in Hama in the 1980s. So I really struggled with that. And I remember a colleague actually confronted me afterwards because I was hiding in the kitchen. I just couldn't bring myself to rally, as you might imagine. And you know, the way she put it was very much like this zero-sum game that you're with him or you're not. And that rubbed me the wrong way for many reasons. You know, it reminded me of that war on terror. You're with the terrorists or you're against them. And so I think moving forward, for sure, within the Syrian American community, I used to work as an organizer, and I know there are a few, but there needs to be more Arab American organizations fronted by a new generation that really tries as much as possible to encourage more of that dialogue. And you know, even someone for me, just because I worked at the embassy, you know, do I have a stain on my record? Does that mean I'm a Assad supporter, a Ba'athist sympathizer? You know, do I just wash my hands and not talk about moving forward and rebuilding? Because I too am more interested in that. I'm more interested in creating, and I still believe we can do it, that better Syria than the one that in many ways was imposed and that we had to accept as is.
Right here in the middle.
My name is Bushra Jabr. I'm Lebanese, but I've worked with the Syrian refugees in Lebanon on education, and I'm very worried about the education. All 7 years now have passed with the whole generation that is nearly illiterate. And another thing that I'm worried about is the craftsmanship, the loss of the craftsmanship. You can rebuild buildings, but it's the human being that we should really focus on. So I don't know if there are any efforts now of projecting what should be done about it. It really is. I've been in some countries where they really recreate, reinitiate the young people on the crafts. Yeah. And it's a very big loss if we lose what Aleppo was known for.
So let's hold the response. I want Lena to reply to that one. Let's take one more question, and then we will wrap it up. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. My name is Katherine Koch. I'm retired from the Foreign Service and visited Halabin at the end of the 80s when I was working with the Palestinian refugees. And I would just like to suggest, you've raised some questions about how to do or what you're doing. And first of all, I want to thank you very much for being here and your presentations. I'm terribly sorry to have forgot that. But in terms of getting movement, I think there is value in non-Syrian linked organizations. And certainly Antonio Guterres, who's now the head of the UN, has a lot of experience in that. We don't know, at least, what the State Department and other United States organizations are doing, at least up until the end of the last administration. And there are things like NDI and the IRI around town. And there are the idea that worked in South Africa and Northern Ireland, for example, was to bring in people who've gone through transitions from dictatorship to democracy to see, to work with the national people to try to get that to happen. The issue you have is Hafiz al-Assad, so it's a tough.
Well, Hafiz is still
Thank
an
you.
issue.
Thank you. So,
I'll
any of you, actually.
Want to
Yeah,
take the
please.
second one? I'll take the first
What
one.
was, I'm sorry, what was the second question? Oh, okay.
She was. The role of non-Syrian organizations in kind of future rebuilding and reconstruction, I think, is one theme that she felt strongly about.
Sure.
And then the first question was about education of this generation of refugees, children.
So on education, and what we do at Kerem is really focused on education, and thank you for your work with Syrian refugees in Lebanon. I know that Lebanon has the most acute case of refugees, in terms of the size of the country and its infrastructure. So I thank you for doing your work and welcoming Syrian refugees. What we do with the kids that we work with at the Kerem Foundation, we have multiple projects, but one that I'm really proud of, and one that we're going to be expanding into different areas. It exists right now in Reyhanli, Turkey, which is right on the Syrian border. About 2 miles away. We have an innovation center that's called Kerem House for Syrian refugee teenagers, both boys and girls. And there they learn how to do 3D design and fabrication. They learn how to code. They learn English and Turkish. We work with them to get them to university on scholarships. It really is a place where you learn how to think. The curriculum that we run there is out of the MIT Media Lab. So the concept of this is really, how can they have Wi-Fi, they have 3D printers, they have a laser cutter, they have this unbelievable curriculum where it teaches them how to work in groups, how to create projects, how to make things. A lot of craft is there, a lot of architecture is there, and design thinking. And the idea is that what if we could give every single thing that we would want for any teenager, in the U.S. or in any advanced country or advanced school, and give that to Syrian refugees who don't have anything at all. And the results are really, really incredible. The Syrian kids that I work with, nobody talks about this, and nobody talks about the past. Nobody even talks really about returning to rebuild. They're talking about what they want to be, what they want to do, where they want to go. And it's really refreshing because they don't have that kind of heaviness, that burden that we have, which is great. And just for one example, and this is private, off the record, that we're doing a studio right now that is actually a virtual exchange studio between the kids at Kerem House and a private school in Florida, and it's designing a new prosthetic limb. And so they're working in teams of 4, 2 kids, Syrian kids in Kerem House, and 2 American kids in the school in Florida. They're working in groups of 4 to design a new prosthetic with virtual exchange. We got a grant to do this from the Aspen Institute. And something incredible, they're still in the midst of doing this, and you can actually see this online on the platform for Kerem House, that the kids in Florida are actually having a more difficult time with this project than the Kerem House kids, because, and we were all shocked by this, because there's a certain level of resiliency and actually seizing this opportunity, whereas kids in Florida are just like my kids in Lake Forest, Illinois, where they have everything, so they kind of don't grasp at it. and it's one of many, many things they might have in their lives. But the kids at Karam House were so invested in this project that they advanced their designs more quickly and were able, and also saw the value in, like, if I can help design a new prosthetic, probably almost every single child and teenager in Rayhanli knows somebody who's an amputee now. So that kind of resilience, and that gives me so much hope, because if we could actually reach kids and give them a piece of that, they are going to take it and run and become something and do something in the future. So that's where I see where we should put the biggest amount of our efforts.
Thank you.
And as to your point about bringing in non-Syrians into this, I definitely see some funding opportunities here, especially among the massive Syrian expatriate community, where money could be used to sort of host a space, inviting Syrians in Syria, outside of Syria, along with educators who know about these best practices from formerly divided societies, such as South Africa, such as Northern Ireland. I mean, that's a film I would love to make, a conversation, this intersectional dialogue about, yes, at the end of the day, how do you rebuild and how do you learn from each other, especially in the more interconnected world that we ostensibly live in.
So please join me in thanking our guests. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and your analysis, but also your personal experiences. And I thank you to the gentleman who asked the question of what do you love, what's your most memorable kind of experience or memory of Aleppo. That was very special, and I think that's kind of sums up the reason why we had this event. And just a couple of plugs before you leave and enjoy the wine and beer and good conversation. The One Journey Festival that I mentioned at the beginning of the event will be June 2nd. Go to the website, onejourneyfestival.com. It will be at the National Cathedral. Jose Andres is going to be there. He'll be doing a show with another refugee chef, and the whole point is to celebrate the talents of refugees. And so it will be a happy conversation, and you'll meet lots of interesting people. And just thank you for coming, and we hope to continue the conversation during the exhibit. Take care.